Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Classens, Assistant Professor, Teaching Stream and Undergraduate Associate Director in the School of the Environment at the University of Toronto. He has written a book, From Distant Swamp to Smiling Farms, Food, Agriculture and Change in the Holland Marsh, published in 2021. Where he focused on social ecological transformation via local food production. He is co-editor of two forthcoming collections, Teaching Food Studies and Hungry for Change, How Post-Secondary Campuses Are Transforming Food System. In his courses, Michael specializes in community-based learning, non-formal learning outside the classroom, and praxis-based pedagogy. And in this talk, he will reflect on the constituent elements of the climate crisis and describe how efforts towards food system transformation can respond to the complexities of climate change adaptation. So, preparing us for a nice lunch.
All right, sorry about the technical difficulties here. I think we've got things sorted out. So first, just let me thank the senior colleague, the senior college, Margaret Proctor and Bill Morgan in particular, for the invitation to join you here today. And thanks, of course, to all the organizers. It was really, it's a privilege, to be here and to be invited to speak here today. I don't think we can take these spaces for granted. Places to come together to talk about climate change and imagine the world otherwise. In many places in the world, we can't have these conversations, including just to the south of us at the moment. So I think that we have to take this responsibility seriously and engage in these discussions with verve and in good faith. So I want to do a few things today in my brief time with you. First, I want to briefly reflect on the constituent elements of climate change, how I understand climate change, and that sets up then the rest of my talk. I'll then outline how the current food system contributes to socio-ecological unsustainability and note a few perils of remaining so reliant on industrialized, long-haul, import-dependent agriculture. And then I'll conclude by addressing how efforts for food systems transformation can respond to the complexity of climate change adaptation. And here I'll take the emphasis on local in my title seriously and highlight some learnings from recent projects. So I'll start about 40 kilometers away in the Holland Marsh, and then in kind of narrowing concentric circles, wind up right here on this very campus. I'm gonna have to change slides on two computers, so that, apologies for the, the disruptions that might cause. So as a friend and colleague, Jason Porter has recently concluded from his historical and political ecological scholarship on arsenic, the social relations are more toxic than the substance. While the proximate cause of climate change may be the release of carbon dioxide, methane, and other chemical compounds into the atmosphere, the distal, more fundamental causes are the social relations that reproduce the activities that insist upon these practices in the first place. Neither climate change nor climate change adaptation are technical problems per se. We know what needs to be done from a technical perspective. Instead, what we face are interconnected social, political, cultural crises, a crisis of imagination, as the writer Amitav Ghosh has put it. Ghosh, incidentally, has speculated that if future societies were to exhume this current moment, in some future society, that they'd no doubt conclude that this was an era of great derangement. I tend to agree. So in a very real way, climate change adaptation is an ontological and epistemological project. The climate crisis has laid bare the limits of Eurocentric, modernist thinking requires a move toward ontological and epistemological equity, an approach that embraces other ways of knowing the world, other ways of apprehending the conditions that create climate change in the first place, and other ways of communicating and mobilizing change. So I show these two images here because in most of my classes, I encourage students to think beyond the essay. both as a kind of axiological commitment to doing scholarship otherwise, and also, again, as a kind of epistemological and ontological project. And so these are just sort of two, recent examples. There's many others. We curate an art show now at the School of the Environment to highlight some of this work. We just had it a couple weeks ago. The image that you see on your left is a heart that a student made by gathering trash and things that she saw on her walk back and forth to school. And then she wrote a very compelling essay, sort of framing this up intellectually within the context of the work that we were dealing with in that class. On the right, you see a young woman wrote a children's book about a young racialized mother and her daughter going to the local farmer's market. So this is a 20-page children's book that she illustrated as well. So these really compelling ways of communicating beyond, again, the scholarly essay. So I don't think I necessarily need to rehearse with this group the notion that we're in the midst of a global polycrisis, from the sixth mass extinction, biodiversity collapse, climate change, increasingly extreme weather, microplastics, persistent forever chemicals, et cetera. The list goes on. But what I do want to briefly highlight is the extent to which the dominant capitalist food system contributes to this socio-ecological polycrisis. So, for example, 15% of global fossil fuel use goes to the food system. Half of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture. 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are for agriculture. 78% of global ocean and freshwater eutrophication is caused by agriculture. 94% of non-human mammal biomass on the Earth is livestock. 71% of bird biomass on the Earth is poultry. So you can see that our food and agriculture system has fundamentally shaped the world's social ecologies. This report here from 2019, the IPCC, this was a special report that they did specifically on food systems emissions. And you can see that they found that the food system accounts for anywhere between 21 to 37% of GHGs. So again, the food system is driving climate change in substantive ways. But we know that the food system, the contemporary food system, is also inequitable. And again, when we think about climate change, we need to think about social dimensions as well. So while it's been 76 years since the right to food was included in Article 25 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, food is still treated as a simple commodity, something to be mediated through one's ability to pay, not an enshrined human right. Food systems are shaped by settler colonialism, racial capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, etc. So access to food is therefore racialized, gendered, etc. And we see this in data around the world. Women are more commonly food insecure. Racialized people are more commonly food insecure. In fact, there was a report done in Toronto just a couple of years ago that found that Black-led households are 3.5 more times likely to be food insecure than white households. Another thing to note here is that our regional agriculture system is made possible by exploitative international labor laws and programs. So this last summer, the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery was here in Canada, looking into our temporary foreign worker program, and assessed the temporary foreign worker program as being, quote, a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery, plagued by wage theft, excessive work hours, limited breaks, and physical abuse. And indeed, that special rapporteur, visited farms in and around, the GTA and Southern Ontario. It's also important to point out that our food system in Canada is globally integrated and heavily dependent on imports. So this happens to be a still shot from a dynamic map called the Canada Food Flows Map, a project by some researchers at UBC. And this happens to show the flow of lettuce. So you can see it's concentrated, obviously, not surprisingly, from California into Canada and also parts of Mexico. We can think of this as essentially, California in particular, a state that has been in a decade-long drought now exporting water. Lettuce is really nothing but water. And California has been exporting it as fast as they can for, as long as this drought has been on. So on average, about 50% of vegetables besides potatoes and 75% of fruits eaten in Canada are imported. Of that, the US supplies about 67% of our vegetables and 36% of our fruits. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, we grow about 100% of the potatoes we eat are grown here in Canada. About 90% of carrots that we eat are grown here in Canada, 90% of cabbage, about 80% of onions, 90% of pulses, so things like peas, kidney beans, lentils. So we do grow quite a lot of food here, but we are inevitably heavily dependent on imports. But of course, this dependence on food imports, particularly from the US and in the midst of a geopolitical realignment, constitutes an acute vulnerability. And this risk is compounded by extreme weather events like heat waves, droughts, and extreme precipitation that adversely impact crop production and food security worldwide. As climate change worsens, the frequency and intensity of weather extremes increases, and research has shown that simultaneous weather extremes occurring in close spatial or temporal vicinity can lead to knock-on social impacts. Kornhuber and colleagues, for example, recently published in Nature that, quote, synchronized crop failures due to simultaneous weather extremes across multiple breadbasket regions pose a risk to global food security and food system supply chains, with potential disproportional impacts for import-dependent regions, aka Canada. Oops. Now, I don't want to belabor this last point. So this has been all the bad news. I'm going to get to some good news in a minute. I don't want to belabor this point, but I do think it bears pointing out that our dependency on the US food imports in particular is an increasingly risky proposition. There are many obvious things to note here, for example, tariffs, but perhaps more importantly is the antagonism toward federal departments by the Trump administration, the active undermining of those departments to do the very work they've been tasked to do. For example, just last week, a leaked memo from the US Department of Agriculture's Research Service Division revealed that the agency has banned a long list of key phrases in an effort to remain compliant with Trump's edicts. Included are the now familiar list of words related to diversity, equity, inclusion that have been banned by other governments and agencies, and indeed on many university campuses since Trump was reelected, but includes many others related to climate change, climate smart agriculture, clean energy, clean water, and dozens more. So these are now words that you cannot say in the Department of Agriculture. So the declining impacts of climate change, corporate concentration, and geopolitical instability have deepened the long-standing social inequity and ecological unsustainability of the capital-intensive industrialized food system. The International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems wrote in a 2022 report that without concerted and immediate action to relocalize, diversify, and decommodify food systems, we were, quote, sleepwalking into the catastrophic and systematic food crises of the future. So the question that I sort of struggle with each day is, what do we do about all of this? There is no blueprint, of course. In her recent book, Hospicing Modernity, Vanessa Machado de Oliveira rejects the modernist notion that configurations as complex as climate change are simple problems to be fixed. Instead, she challenges us to consider the world as we knew it is dying, and urges us to seek new social and ecological configurations, new relationships, new ways of being in the world. As she put it, we need to grow up, step up, and show up for ourselves, our communities, and the living earth. This quote here is one that I use often in my courses, and I've used it in my writing. This happens to be from the feminist economist J.K. Gibson Graham. And I think that this is it comes out of a critique that they've leveled against conventional political economic analysis, which they suggest is too reductive. It's sort of blinkered by the possibility of different ways of living in the world. And what they want to do is demonstrate the ways in which in each day, in each moment of our lives, that we all have the opportunity to make some small change, and that we shouldn't be discouraged in the face of the enormity of the challenges. And I think that this is ultimately a kind of hopeful message. And again, one that I try to impart to my students and internalize in the work that I do as well. Check my time here. Okay, so that was a bit of framing about how I think about the climate crisis and the ways in which this is maybe exacerbated by the food system. So I want to now move to a brief discussion of local food from different vantage points to illustrate some of the challenges and opportunities of building more socially just and climate adapted local food systems. And so I'm going to sort of share kind of 4 little vignettes through which I'll highlight 4 things. One is we need to prioritize the protection of urban and peri-urban land for agriculture. 2, we need to support the third sector's vision for food systems transformation and include them in local food systems governance. 3, we need to re-engage youth in civic life and include them in food systems governance as well. And 4, we need to understand education, both formal in the classroom and non-formal learning beyond the classroom, as key leverage points in food systems transformation. So I'll start here with the Holland Marsh. So I did my dissertation research on this project. Many of you, I'm sure, have driven through the Holland Marsh, or maybe you've even visited one of the farmers markets in the Holland Marsh. And this is often held up as the exemplar of local food, known colloquially as Toronto's market garden. But the full story, of course, isn't quite as rosy. Some of you may know that this was, Holland Marsh, as the name implies, wetland that was drained in the 1920s. So the canal was dug around about 200 acres of it. The water was drained off, and what you get after that process is what's known as the organic order of soil, or muck soil. And this is essentially millennia of plant life growing, dying, and settling at the bottom, and you get this incredibly rich growing media. The problem with the organic order of soil is that once you've drained off the water, it's a very unstable soil, and it erodes very rapidly, either in downpour rains, windy conditions. The soil is very unstable. It also breaks down much faster than mineral soil. And so, in places when the marsh was originally drained, there was, 7, 8, 9 feet of this muck soil. Now, if you go to the marsh, you'll see, particularly on the edges, now there's greenhouses popping up because the soil is gone, and it's only been several decades. It takes about 10,000 years to grow an inch of this soil, but we can run through it in about a decade. So that inch will, so it's a very unsustainable kind of farming. And in fact, it's very likely that within our lifetimes, we'll see in the marsh that, pretty much all of that muck soil will be gone. And in the marsh, it's a very specialized growing area. So they grow carrots, onions, cabbage, these kinds of things. Extremely productive, but it's a bit of a flash in the pan. It also has been very chemically dependent in the past. There's been a lot of sort of, phosphate, use for a while. Lake Simcoe, which is, connected to the Holland Marsh, had massive algal blooms, for example. Now, some of that has been sort of remediated, and there's been some changes in sort of how they farm in the Holland Marsh in response to that. The marsh is also threatened, of course, by urban development. So all along the edges of the marsh now, we see sort of suburban development. This is Highway 400. Some of you may recognize this. But we also have Highway 413, the proposed Highway 413, which will run sort of to the north side of the marsh through existing wetland. And so there are all these pressures on the marsh. And it seems to me that in this era of climate chaos, increasing rates of food insecurity, et cetera, that it would behoove us to protect areas like this and many others. And our current provincial leadership doesn't share that opinion, of course. But again, I think that what we need to do is to be protecting urban and peri-urban land for agricultural use. Because we know that, again, geopolitically, climatically, this kind of long-haul industrial import-heavy model is not a sustainable one, and it isn't one that we should be relying on. So the other thing I want to highlight here is the role of the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector plays an outsized role in attempting to fill the gaps left over by our current food system. So just a little story here. From April 2020 to December 2021, in the midst of COVID, the Canadian federal government earmarked $330 million through the Emergency Food Security Fund to address food insecurity in the COVID-19 global pandemic. These funds were distributed through a handful of national and regional emergency food organizations, and then sort of dispersed further to frontline organizations like the ones that you see here, to purchase emergency food provisions, personal protective equipment, and to hire additional workers. Now, these funds, on the face of it, and one of the things that Trudeau did is sort of announce this funding through an appeal just in advance of Thanksgiving from a Metro store. So it was served as a Metro commercial as well, a Metro grocery store commercial, and suggested that Canadians should donate money and donate things to the food bank. The problem, of course, is that this doubles down on a failed 40-year policy of food charity. The first food bank opened just about 40 years ago in Edmonton, in Canada. And since then, we've seen a proliferation of food banks. But also increasing rates of food insecurity every single year, increasing rates of food bank usage every single year. And so these investments, possibly well-intentioned, are ultimately ineffective. And over the course of COVID and these investments, what the effect was is to move organizations who were focused on food policy work and food justice work and climate adaptation and these kinds of things away from that work and turn them into food banks. And so this is what our research showed during this period in this article here. And I also sort of lived this because I was working with one of these organizations at the time as a volunteer, and we went from doing sort of like climate focused work to just sort of packing food boxes to give to people. Now, I'm not sort of dismissing the importance of giving people who need food, but what I am saying is that we shouldn't necessarily be doing that at the expense of thinking more about fundamental social and ecological transformation in the context of the food system. Next thing I'll briefly speak about is a project. I worked with about 20 youth who identified themselves as being active at the intersection of food and climate justice. This was work that I did over the course of the last year to really generate a bold vision for climate change adaptation through the food system in Toronto, and try to get some specific policy and program recommendations as well. And it was really interesting work. And what we found, of course, is that youth don't feel particularly engaged by traditional government, right? Municipal, provincial, or federally. And they see these issues as in a very kind of capacious way. That brings in questions of, employment, third spaces, they brought up issues of sort of corporate control. They, of course, bring up the idea of food as this kind of inalienable right. They brought up questions of trust vis-a-vis the municipal government. I think that this is a generation of people who have grown up in this firmament that we find ourselves in, who feel frustrated that governments aren't doing more to address these existential crises that we face. They see the news, that climate collapse, et cetera, and don't see a sort of commensurate response by those in power. And so I think there's a really deep sense of frustration among this cohort. And in some cases, it leads to a retreat from civic life. Now, the group that we worked with had all but abandoned the idea that the government had any role to play here or had any hope that they actually would do much, but were getting on with the business of change themselves. So they were entrepreneurs, they had started nonprofits, they were doing all kinds of incredible work, but never even really considered that the government could be a partner in this work. So I think that we need to re-engage this cohort, these youth, in civic life, to try to kind of assuage these feelings of alienation and disaffection, even depression that many of them feel, and build a culture, rebuild a culture of kind of democratic engagement. The final thing I'll just note here, I think I'm running short on time, is another project that I've been working on for the last couple of years has been looking more specifically at how students on university campuses are organizing for at this intersection of food and climate. So we've identified about 150 organizations on campuses across Canada. We've surveyed about 100 of them. We've interviewed about 50 of them. And I don't have time to talk about this work extensively, but I just want to note a few things that these organizations are sort of student-run organizations that have a very different vision for the food system than the one that I spoke, than the one that we sort of encounter every day. They have commitments to governance and leadership models that depart very differently from this corporate kind of model that, again, we see manifest by the conventional food system. They have deep commitments to social and ecological transformation. They see this food work that they're doing as a way to use food as an organizing tool, right? To think about change, to think about a more climate resilient local food system. They see education and outreach as a key part of that work. And so this is just a few that exist here on our very campus who are doing this work, on a daily basis, right? So the U of T Food Coalition, for example, it was an organization that just got going on our campus last year. And this year, all year, they, on Fridays, they run a free meal program. So you can just sort of go by, it's run in the student union building on College there in Huron. And you can go and get a free meal. They've integrated a little lecture series into it. So someone will come in and give a short lecture for say 15, 20 minutes about some subject that has to do with, climate change or food systems. And it's built a nice community, right? And it's engaged people, and it's been growing over the course of this last year. And then, some of these other groups as well. There's a group that's started some community fridges on campus. There are multiple growing spaces, small growing spaces on campus. You may see them sometimes where there's food being grown in collaboration with community partners often. There's an organization, Meal Care, again, student organizers who will take food that would otherwise be wasted and redistribute it to those who need it. They told me at an orientation, one day during orientation last September, they redirected 3,000 pounds of food in one day. It's an incredible amount of food that they were able to save from going to some landfill and redirect it to both the food bank here on campus, but also in partnership with community partners just beyond campus. They would bring the food to these food banks, really sort of demonstrating how University of Toronto can be good neighbors, right, to those who sort of just outside of our borders. So again, I could talk about this work for a long, long time, but I won't leave it here. But it's very inspiring work and demonstrates that even if students aren't necessarily recognizing themselves in formal levels of government, they are extremely active. They take the crises that we face very seriously and are very, very active in trying to address it, in ways that make sense to them. Just by way of closing, just in terms of some future work. So I was very fortunate to be part of a project. Morning Isaac at University of Toronto Scarborough was the lead applicant. I was a co-applicant on this, and we were awarded earlier this year about $4 million through the NSERC and SHRC Sustainable Agriculture Research Initiative. And our project is called Strengthening Sustainable Urban and Peri-Urban Agricultural Systems for Net Zero Food Systems. And so we're embarking now on this project, this 5-year project, to really think about what does a net zero food system for Toronto look like. And so we'll be sort of continuing to do this work. again, for the next 4 or 5 years. And we're very excited about, we've got a very large team, lots of students, et cetera. So we're very much looking forward to that. I think I've gone a bit over time, so I'll stop here. But again, thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here. And